Okay, Mrs. Sequist. How long have you been married to Mr. Sequist?
53 years.
And in your opinion, what types of communication keeps your relationship together after all those years?
Actually, whatever communication. I think we wouldn't be together if we didn't somehow figure out how to communicate.
And would you say that if ever there was a fight or a disagreement between you two, would you use like I language where you're like, I feel this way, or would you use you language where you are doing this or you are making me feel this way to resolve those problems?
You probably should most often use the I rather than a blaming thing. If you're asking me what I do, I'm aware of that. I am sure I've been guilty.
It is difficult to refrain from using you language.
Exactly. But I do recognize the difference.
Mm-hmm. Think of a friendship that you have had for a long time. Who was it with?
I could think of two friendships, both of whom I've had my whole life. One was a young girl that I grew up next to, Margaret Barr. And so I moved to that house when I was 5, so I knew her from 5 years on. And even though once we hit high school years and we separated, didn't go to school together thereafter, not even high school, to this day I get a birthday card from Margaret Barr on my birthday every year. And I have to think of her as a longtime friend, partially because we knew each other. We probably haven't had all that much communication. This is what this is about, but it's a loyalty. And
Why
a
do you
friend.
think your friendship lasted so long?
Because we appreciated, as we got older probably, and looking back, we appreciated what we meant to each other when we were young. And it's nice to have friends with people that you knew. I knew her parents, she knew my parents. A lot of my current friends don't know my background.
Mm-hmm. And so you were a mother of 3. What do you think some of the greatest challenges in being a mother and raising 3 girls in terms of communication issues?
I think the hugest challenge in all of our relationships, including children, is how to communicate and how to know what they're feeling. I know what I feel, but we have to. And actually, I remember when the girls were probably teen years, maybe younger, I read about active listening. It was a book printed, and I saw, I don't want to be dogmatic. I got to listen to them too. And I think on more than one occasion, you can ask your parents, we tried sitting in a circle and making sure, and the active listening part was that we had to make sure we heard them. So we were taught to repeat what they said.
Okay, so you practiced skills like that where you put
Tried
yourself
to.
in each other's shoes
Tried to.
and listen to each other.
But
That's good.
I want to say, since you're interviewing me, I'm sure there are many occasions when we didn't hear. Many.
That happens.
I'm not beginning to say we succeeded.
And in your opinion, what is one of the greatest challenges today in terms of effectively communicating with others?
Probably twofold. I think it's always challenging when the person you want to communicate with is more reticent to do the same. And sometimes we learn it in our growing up. Sometimes it's just some of us are more outgoing with our feelings than others.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's always a challenge.
Yeah,
And the other one is that I think I worry about the, not my generation, but my grandchildren and others, how much they rely on these tech devices. And that eliminates seeing
Yeah.
the physical response. And it eliminates not only seeing it, but for the person who's maybe texting, they don't see what my reaction or
So there could be miscommunications in texting and emails and stuff.
There could be, and also maybe young children, if they're doing this right from an early age, they're not going to learn how to read the visual.
Yeah, physical
Signs.
communication. That's okay, good. And those are all the questions I have for you. Thank you.
For interviewing me.
Of course. Hello, Mrs. Gottlieb. I would like to ask you a few questions about communication as a parent. Okay, so what do you notice about how your children choose their friends?
Well, I have 4 children, and having watched the 4 of them grow up, my youngest is 14 years old right now. And typically, my children have chosen their friends based on similar interests, I'd say. So, my daughters, who both were on swim team, their friends primarily swam on the swim team with them. And I found the same with my sons. They found like-minded friends who had similar values and similar goals, who took the same classes, and who did the same activities. So it seemed to primarily be based on interest and goals, I'd say.
And what have you observed or noticed about the way your children communicate with their friends?
That's a really interesting question. I've noticed it's changed because my oldest daughter's 22, and when she was younger, we weren't using smartphones at the time. And so the way she communicated with her friends is she would pick up the phone and call them, and they would call her using the house phone number. And so she learned at an early age to, when she called a friend's house, if the parents answered, how to say, hello, this is Robin calling, may I please speak to Meryl, for example. And that was the way they communicated, was by phone or in person. Or they would write notes to each other. I think I used to find notes in Robin's backpacks. And same with probably you. Over time, as smartphones became more integrated, I think, let's see, I'm trying to remember when the kids all got their first smartphones. Cameron's the youngest in the family, and he's had the smartphone the longest. He got it in probably 6th grade, which is really young. But I've noticed that now the primary means of communication seems to be texting between kids, between friends, and also even with me. So although I have a phone and my children are able to call me, they tend to text me. I think that's good and that's bad. Did you ask me positive and negative about that?
No,
Oh.
I was going to ask you after.
Okay, sorry.
I can cut all of this out.
Okay.
What do you think are some of the positives and negatives involved with communication between young people today?
That's a great question. I think the positives in terms of using technology is that it's extremely accessible, so that kids carry their smartphones in their pockets 24/7, basically, is what I've noticed. So I know as a parent that if I want to get in touch with one of my children, I can simply send a text, and typically I hear back within 10 seconds. And that's global. So those children who are traveling overseas, who might be international, even with the time change, I can send a text and know that my children are getting my message, and they respond quickly. I think that's a really great positive to communication. It's instantaneous, and it's simple, and it's free, which is amazing. I remember when I went to Europe, it was difficult to communicate, and I had to call long distance using a payphone and put money into the phone, and it was extremely expensive, and my parents would never accept the phone call, the collect call. With today, we can Skype each other for free and use the internet to communicate easily. I think that's a positive. The negative, though,
Yeah,
I'd
what do you
say,
think the negatives are that come from using technology to communicate?
the negatives, I think, is that sometimes there's a false sense of relationship. Aside from the fact that it's easy and simple, I think sometimes people might feel connected with somebody because they're sharing a message in Facebook or sharing a message through a text or some sort of social media, maybe a picture on Instagram or a picture on Snapchat. I think that makes people feel like they're connected, but in fact, when you analyze it, sometimes I think people feel perhaps less connected, especially if they feel excluded, if there's pictures that are posted and they're not part of the group. That type of communication, I think, can be harmful, and I think it makes it very difficult to grow up in that sort of social pressure. I think it's harder for high school kids today than it perhaps used to be because we weren't aware what everyone else was doing. Here, everything's posted, and so if you weren't, for example, invited to a certain event and all of your friends are there and it's posted, you know it, and that can be negative and difficult.
And how do you tend to manage conflict in a relationship with your spouse?
Oh, that's a great question. I think conflict, of course, every relationship has conflict, including mine and my husband's. But we have found over time, we've been married 28 years, that it really boils down to communication and space and time, so that if we are having a conflict over something, whether it be a plan or actually whatever it is, for us it works best to just sort of walk away from each other and take time apart and reflect and come back and communicate when we're not angry or upset. It's just better for us to have time and space.
And so when you guys give each other space to let emotions exit the picture, do you find you use a lot of I language where, for example, you say, I feel this way because, or this made me feel, or do you use you language where you doing this or you made me feel?
That is
what do you find
question.
that you use the most?
Probably the most effective, if we're actually going to resolve something, is if I use the I language. And if I share how I feel and how something affects me personally. It's hard to do that because you have to really self-reflect and be calm. I find that the you language probably isn't as effective and isn't as helpful in problem solving.
But you think it happens more often because emotions are always involved.
Sure. I think that it's easy to point a finger and point blame and use more of that kind of you terminology, as you explained. That's easier to do. And so it's challenging. Resolving conflict, I think, is probably the hardest part of a relationship because there's always conflict. But I do think that space and time and approaching things calmly with communication seems to be the key for us.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions I have.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
It was a pleasure.
Hello, Mr. Hart. I'm going to ask you a couple questions today about communication in relationships.
Perfect.
Okay, so do you think technology has affected communication between people positively or negatively?
I think both. I mean, positively for sure, and I think as a good example, I spent 3 months on an overseas assignment in India, away from the family for 3 months. Can be incredibly difficult, but being able to communicate with them via FaceTime or Skype, video conferencing, is an enormous positive aspect of technology. The negative, of course, is that the typical scenario, I think, of the family sitting at the dinner table, perhaps all on their mobile devices and, texting away, that takes away from the communication that people have, sitting at the dinner table. So that's a negative aspect of technology.
Do you think that over time people are becoming less skilled in physical and body language communication?
Absolutely,
with
there's no question
the
about
effect of technology?
I think so, absolutely, that's right, yes. I think that it can be very easy. Perhaps it's easier to communicate via text or via, sending an email rather than actually sitting face to face and talking to someone. You do miss out on that body language, and I think you do lose those skills if you don't. You lose those effective communication or conversational skills if you're not actually, if you're communicating via technology all the time. Absolutely.
And do you think with the advancement of technology, romantic relationships have become easier to sustain and more effective, or do you think there are negatives to
I think
having
it's a
technology?
negative, absolutely. I think, it is more difficult to, I think, build those, you build a long-term relationship if you're not actually right there, getting to know that person, understanding that person, do you share the same moral values, do you have the same beliefs? I think you miss all of that if you are reliant on technology, where perhaps you're not sitting face to face with that.
Yeah,
with that
where the
person.
body language displays their true feeling for
Ab-
something.
Absolutely, that's right. Yes.
And what advice might you have to offer in terms of effective communication within a workplace? So it's not someone you're romantically involved with.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I'm maybe a little bit old-fashioned in this sense, but of course we've got the advent of instant messaging and text messaging and email. In the workplace, and I do this all the time, it's important to speak with a person face to face, or pick up the phone and talk to that person. I think you miss out on the body language. I think there's such a danger in relying on email and text messaging and instant messaging, because messages can be misinterpreted. Especially, you write a bold word or underlined word, to emphasize that point, that can be misunderstood. So I think it's important, particularly in the workplace, to pick up the phone, just talk to the person, have a conversation. Ideally, if it's in person, even better.
And do you think, elaborating on this, do you think that it has caused more challenges in communication within a family?
Yeah. I gave that example of sitting at the dinner table and everyone's sort of on their text messages, and of course we lead such busy lives as well. It can be very difficult as a family to find that time to sit together. You've got soccer practice with the two boys, or your wife's away at the book club. Dad's late for work. He's stuck in traffic, and of course it can be very difficult to find that time to sit together as a family and and talk as a family.
But do you think with such busy lives, it's easy to stay in touch rather than communicate, but to stay in touch with each
Stay in
other with
touch.
the technology?
Absolutely, that's right. No, that's the absolute. There's no question about it. I mean, my 11-year-old has a phone, and I text him, and it's great that we have the ability to video conference and use FaceTime and Skype. I do a bit of travelling internationally, and the most difficult bit about travelling internationally, of course, is being away from family, and being able to stay in touch with them every day and see them every day and see what they're up to is a huge plus when it comes to technology.
Okay, thank you. Those are all the questions I have
Thanks
right
very
now.
much.
Of course.
Thank you.
What is the most difficult thing about communicating with parents?
Well, probably.
Say you and your mom and dad get into a disagreement. What do you think the most difficult thing about having effective communication is?
Well, I think, at least from my personal experience, it's always been hard when I feel a certain way and they feel a certain way, and then if there's any type of closed-mindedness on either end, then it's hard to hear each other and come to a compromise, or able to effectively communicate our points and then come to like if I'm really closed-minded and I'm not rationally hearing what mom and dad have to say, or if they're being closed-minded and aren't listening to what I have to say, then there's no way that we can meet in the middle, and that ends up challenging.
And do you think that it has to do with using you language? For instance, you're doing this, or you are making me feel this way, or
Yeah.
you are blank.
Yeah, I think saying you puts the blame on the other party, when if you just talk about how you're feeling.
Using I language, where I feel this way
Yeah,
because...
yeah, exactly. If I make it more about me, and then it makes it easier for, I guess, them to hear me and be rational.
And do you think I language or you language is more challenging than the other?
Yeah, I think it takes some humility to be able to use I language. It's always easier to point the finger at somebody else. It's harder to accept the fact that some things are on you and that the blame is sometimes your own fault. But I think it is important. I think there's a balance too. It's not always, Yeah, I mean, it might be helpful to start using I language, saying, like, I understand that this is on me, but then that makes it easier for you to then open up about some issues that you might have with the other party. So, like, if I'm talking to my parents and I want them to hear me and before they get defensive, I have to say things that I recognize that I'm doing wrong, or things that are on my side, before they can actually have a conversation and open up that dialogue.
And someday you're going to be a mother, you hope. What do you think your goals are for communicating as a mother to your children in the future, given your experiences being a child yourself?
Well, I hope I can be open-minded, and I want to be able to hear the points of view of my kids, and even though I know as parents it's easy to think they know best, I don't want to be the type of parent that makes executive decisions. I want to be able to work with my children and hear what they have to say and how they're feeling before I make decisions with my potential spouse. But I think it's a team effort. It's not about one person having a say over another. It's about working together to come up with compromises and solutions that work for everyone in the relationship, because when it's one-sided and if parents lay down the law, then it just, without taking into account how their children feel, then the children aren't going to respond well to that. They're not going to be on the same side as the parents. They're not going to understand where they're coming from as easily. So I think it's important for it to be a team effort in the relationship.
And do you think when emotions are involved, obviously you have feelings for your spouse or your children, do you think that it is important to recognize your own feelings as well as put yourself in the place of the other person's feelings in order to effectively communicate?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, feelings can be really strong and they can end up clouding judgment sometimes, so it's important to recognize that and be aware of how emotions can end up clouding judgment before you go into conversations like that. So it's definitely important to be aware of your own feelings, but also put yourself in the shoes of the person you're having a conversation with to understand where they're coming from.
All right, thank you. I appreciate your time.